My name is Sinead O'Sullivan, and I work with the economist, Professor Michael Porter, at Harvard Business School's Institute of Strategy and Competitiveness. One of our main themes of research is that of geographic competitiveness. However, during the last 18 months, for obvious reasons, I've started to think deeply about whether or not competitiveness is still tied directly to fixed geographic locations, and the extent to which digital technologies are helping or even hindering with competitiveness at the firm and the national level. Through my research, I've managed to meet some of the world's most interesting thinkers of these topics. And for this panel, I brought them together in an amazing way to share and showcase their thoughts. I spoke to Mark Lutter about the economic offering of existing and startup cities and the role of cities in alleviating poverty and bringing millions of people out of poverty in the global south.
Well, I run the Charter Cities Institute. We're a nonprofit that builds the ecosystem for charter cities. Charter cities are new cities with better laws. We believe this is important because every year there are over 75 million new urban residents. This means the equivalent to 10 Hong Kongs. Most of them are in Africa and Asia, and they're entering urban environments that do not have good physical infrastructure or governance infrastructure, which leads to low productivity, little economic gains over time, and the unfortunate reality that many of them are unable to really make better lives for them and or their children. And we believe by creating better governance systems that are embedded within the new cities and new urban spaces that are being constructed for these urban residents, we can set the groundwork for sustained economic growth and the tens of millions of people out of poverty. If we look at cities in high-income countries, I believe they're facing a different set of challenges. Historically, cities have functioned as labor markets. So you move to a city, why? Because there's more demand for your skills, you can command higher wages, and that allows you to live a better life. However, what we're seeing now, for example, kind of a common thread that we see in internet discussions is the internet is the world's largest city. And what this means is a lot of functions that traditionally were reserved for in-person meetings in terms of exchange of ideas, in terms of getting hired, in terms of making friends, have now migrated online, where you're able to exchange ideas on Twitter or on blogs. You're able to make friends on also on Twitter or on kind of video games, things like this. You're able to work fully remote. And this is a challenge of what is one of the core functions that a city provides, namely this labor market, this kind of place where you are located in a particular point in time. And as more of our social life translates online and more of our professional life translates online, the value proposition of a city really needs to be redefined. So I think one of the, key advantages, values of a charter city as opposed to a traditional city is one, governance, having a degree of governance authority that allows you to, for example, expedite building and planning approvals, and just being able to move much more quickly because they do have these embedded governance rights allows for a much more dynamic city environment. And of course, it's very early days for many of these projects. Right, it takes a very long time to build a city. This is a value proposition over decades. However, if people are able to embed some of these principles in terms of moving quickly, in terms of a more permissive legal and regulatory environment to allow for faster firm formation as well as faster firm failure, they can experiment with a different set of policies and a kind of wide-ranging set of administrative practices where we could begin to see different elements of the city reinvented. If we look at what happened in China over the last 40 years lifted 800 million people out of poverty, largely through special economic zones combined with urbanization. I believe it's possible to take those lessons and apply them in the developing world more broadly, where we are seeing rapid urbanization and figuring out what it means to create these frameworks that can really help these new urban residents live a better life for themselves and their children.
Following from startup cities, I spoke to Rosanna about how to actually design a city for the future, and specifically about the role of digital places as it pertains to work and competitiveness at the firm level.
I'm Rosanna Covacich, and I'm co-founder of the Place Bureau. I work in partnership with another Rosanna Vitiello. We're a strategic studio. And what we do is we work with master planners, brand destinations, and districts to help them define and distill place narratives. One of the things is they take a long time to build and they take a long time to change. But I think what I'm most curious about is the psychology that's emerging now. So on the one hand, you have the external drivers that we're all very, very familiar with, climate change, resource scarcity, digital acceleration, the well-being factor. But then on the other hand, we have something that is almost timeless, and that's our human needs, the needs for attainment, for belonging, our identity, fulfillment. And so I think what is really interesting when there are extreme moments of change is how do these two come together, and what are the themes that are playing out? I think another thing that you hear about, and it's not new to anyone, but it's the idea of remote working. But let's call it the big remote, because it's really been powered up by the pandemic. And actually, when you're thinking about remote, it's been remote everything. Everything's gone online. It's almost like a mode of survival. So we've had online shopping, we've had incredible consumption of entertainment online, and we also have working remotely. I think for me, what's been fascinating through all of this is you've seen the advent of digital nomadic visas coming to the fore. I'm in Croatia now, and it's a country that offers that. And you also have that with the Bahamas. I think that that's extremely exciting. For offices themselves, if we're talking about physical location, and also commercial developers, some are saying people are going to come back to the office, but really what we're saying is we need to really rethink this space, and there's a lot of people talking about hybrid spaces. What does that mean? They can be anything. We like to think more about spaces as content. So what content can you put into these spaces rather than marking them up for specific use? And by content, I think of things like cultural happenings, creative spaces. So a redefining of how we're talking about, the layout of spaces, for want of a better word. The idea of remote working has always been there. I think it's just the psychology behind it. The expectation of presenteeism was still enforced before now, and that's no longer a kind of an intrinsic behavior that we need to abide by. We don't have to have that fear of always showing face in a physical setting. So my question to organizations is really, what is the role of HQ now? HQ was highly revered as the center of power, the beacon of identity for an organization. Now, what is it going to be? Because it's going to have to be kind of a really strong beacon and signal to get people to come back to it. So there is kind of talk around, and I kind of find that quite fascinating, about HQs suddenly becoming showcases of the brand that they are representing, rather than, a place where lots and lots of workers come to. I think, as a futurist, as an occasional futurist, when I put that hat on, you always look back to look forward. And another thing we always say is the future is already here. So it's just not immediately apparent. So I can definitely say behind closed doors, and a lot of the projects that myself and my business partner, Rosanna, work on are city projects, or certainly very significant developments currently in the UK and Europe. Every single one is not going to be visible for another 20 years, and yet we're designing now for that. So the future is here for us. It's just not seen yet. One topic that just keeps on coming in, and the sound is so high on that, it's incredible, and it's what I call nature everywhere. So every design charrette we do, every what if scenario workshop we do with all of the designers, all the time, like the discussion around kind of the intersection between people, place, and planet is dead center in that conversation. So, for want of a better word, for me, it's like the aperture, the lens is really narrowing around discussions around, well, let's do a town center, let's think about retail spaces, blah, blah, blah. And the aperture is totally expanding around, how can we design places that really care for people and also care for nature, and how can the two come together?
Unlike Mark and Rosanna, who are thinking about concentrations of people in physical and digital spaces, Parag talked to me about why he thinks that lower instead of higher concentrations of people is the future, and the geopolitics of the global West versus the global East in terms of cities.
Hi, I'm Parag. Great to see you, Sinead. Pleasure to join you. I'm based in Singapore. I'm an academic, a traveler, an advisor to governments and companies. My firm is called FutureMap. We do a lot of work on mapping out global infrastructure and investment patterns. And we also have a technology product called Climate Alpha, which looks at hundreds of variables to make future predictions on real estate, land, and other property asset prices.
And you've just written a new book.
Oh, yeah, I write books. Move is coming out imminently, and it's my 7th book, and it's about human geography and the future of human geography. Why are we where we are? And what drives us to be somewhere else over time? So what are the 100,000-year patterns of human mobility? And again, our genetic composition, our ethnographic kinds of variables, all of that is human geography. So I won't go into all of that, but suffice it to say that the thesis is that billions of people will relocate between now and 2030, 2040, 2050. The question is, where will they go? Then let's take the issue of, well, what it means to be a remote person where you are. I think there's two things there. One is you're still tied to a formal employer that has a physical office and headquarters, and you report to them, and they may even want to know where you live in order to impose a cost of living adjustment on your salary. And of course, that's the kind of company that you don't want to necessarily continue to work for, but rather you want to go with one that says, we don't care where you are, you're going to get your San Francisco salary. And given tight labor markets, there's going to be a great arbitrage there for talented people. The second part of that second axis is, of course, people who are entirely in the cloud first companies. Mm-hmm. You formed your company in the cloud, your team can be anywhere, no one cares where anyone else is. And of course, that was some smaller percentage of kind of total digital work amongst obviously younger companies for quite some time. So you're born on GitHub, basically, right? And I think that obviously that trend is also going to grow and expand in the years ahead as a share of the workforce. The message there is you miss people when they're gone, right? And the whole world is going to be afflicted by this when you miss people when they're gone, because we're experiencing depopulation in the Northern Hemisphere. But then let's remember that the majority of the human population has not been making any such considerations because they're in Asia. And Asians are still flocking to and gravitating towards the cities, the mega cities, because the quality of life is so much better than rural areas or second-tier cities. You have obviously higher quality housing, you have faster internet access, better education, higher wages, better medical care, and of course, access to airports and travel. So you're not going to meet any young Asians who aren't still flocking to Ho Chi Minh City or Bangkok or whatever the case may be. When you see these devolutionary movements today, where cities are saying that they want to have place-based visas, right? And even maybe their own kind of currency in some way, in order to make themselves sticky as destinations for talented workers and to retain the capital investment and to have the tax revenue remain localized and so forth. That's at the city and the provincial level. It could be Western Australia, it's Catalonia, and the Basque region, it's California. These kinds of things are happening all over the world as cities realize that the centrality of the federal government in being the conduit for investment capital is just no longer necessary because each place has built its own connections to the outside world. You'll have that push, and I think that's going to incrementally restore the status of the city.
Finally, I spoke to Alex McDowell about his work world building for the Minority Report and whether or not he thinks that creating this distinction between macro and micro in our existing worlds reflects our reality.
Hi, so I'm Alex McDowell, as you say. I'm a production designer by trade, I guess. I've grown up since going to art school in London in 1975. Moving quickly into media, music videos, commercials, and movies. So my background is in film mostly, but I would say that my focus is on narrative design systems. I use a methodology called world building, which is something I launched and developed in 2000. We're interested in something that you mentioned in a previous conversation of the macro to the micro, and I think in the reality of the world as it works, in the reality of the arc through history to the future, in the idea that there is no present, that it's constantly moving, obviously from the past to the future, but there's a frame around us in the near term that is a kind of bedrock platform that we can gather knowledge from, and then we can apply it equally to the past or the future. If you walk out of your front door into the world, you can turn left or right and find yourself in entirely different worlds. If you walk down the street, you're intersecting thousands of intersecting worlds, in the sense that if you drill into any of those points, the store, the city, the individual, the dog, they all have a connected network, which is kind of infinitely large, going back through generations, going back through history, going future forward into vision. So there is no single world. Every single world that we do is only defined by the questions that are being asked. Now, in a very different sort of sense of scale, but I think directly applies to cities, we're building a new visual language for the pancreatic beta cell. So we're now working in a system that is as complex as a human city, a single cell, and we're applying to it exactly the same methods and premise and approaches, but with a complete integration of art science to the extent, it's a single word, working with crystallographers and molecular biologists and scientists of all stripes, with game makers and engineers and architects and designers and media makers of all stripes. And coming together there, we're building the equivalent of a city system that represents a single cell that's scientifically accurate and is essentially not predictive in this case, but setting up an environment that can change the future. The pancreatic beta cells focused is the source of diabetes. So there's enormous attention on that one cell. So very kind of unprecedented. It's not usual for the designer to step into a world that hasn't been scripted. The production would not have yet started. But in this case, Steven Spielberg wanted to move forward and develop the script as the world developed. And so we were placed in this position of having to develop a world at the broadest level of the rules. 50-year future, Washington, D.C., 3 precognitive beings predicting murder and violent crime. That was it. That's really all we had to work with. What we were able to do is, just by interrogating those different intersections, was build out a very detailed world, so that we knew, before there was a script, we knew what opportunities Tom Cruise had, to what happens if he turns left or right out of his front door. And we were able to develop these apparently predictive ideas like autonomous vehicles, because we were listening carefully to experts that we were interrogating, because our intent was, or our brief was, to develop future reality, not science fiction. And so the impetus was on us, or the onus was on us, to go really deep into the foundational knowledge so that we could say this world is real, this world could exist.
These conversations universally challenge this idea that the city is becoming less relevant, especially as we look towards digital technologies, platforms, and the metaverse. In reality, however, in both developing and developed economies, this couldn't be further from the truth. Cities play an important role economically, socially, and geopolitically, perhaps even more so than the nation state. But the big question remains is, how do we use these cities to better serve us in the future than we have done in the past? And here, I think, is where technology plays a really important role. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks for taking part.